Hey Earthkeepers! In this episode, James and I continue our conversation with John Philip Newell about his new book, The Great Search, Turning to Earth and Soul in the Search for Healing and Home. As we said last time, in this book, John Philip argues for a reimagining of how we relate to creation, to each other, to God, and even to ourselves. He advocates for engaging creation as the primary means of knowing God, of seeing the sacred in all life forms, and of loving all creation as we love ourselves. And because our conversation was so full of emerging truths and insights, we split this into 2 episodes. In this, the second half of our conversation, we pick up at a point just after John Philip has explained how some religious teachings have made us forget how to fall in love with nature and caused us to lose sight of the divine presence in everything all around us. Here then is part 2 of our conversation with John Philip Newell.
I really appreciated your chapter on Nan Shepherd because it highlighted for me a life that did seek that revelation in the wider world in a very beautiful, intentional, consistent, and passionate way. The way that she sought Earth in a very particular place, the Cairngorm mountain range of the Scottish Highlands. And you highlight the time, attention, and love that she gave those mountains and the passionate sense of connection that she cultivated. And at one point, I just want to quote something you wrote. The mountain invites her to be and to let go to the flow of light that courses deep in the body of her being and the body of Earth. This is what pilgrimage into the heart of the natural world does to us. It invites us to be. I really resonated with that, perhaps in a smaller way. I feel like personally I've had moments like that, if not a sort of a lifetime sense of connection to particular place, or feeling like the earth and myself are sort of part of that oneness. And it's definitely something that we attempt to invite people into through our work with Circlewood and Earthkeepers. And we're also aware that many, many people don't have access to such beautiful wild places, and whether it's due to their social circumstances or perhaps being limited to their urban environment or physical limitations, that engaged, immersive aspect of life just might not be accessible. And I'm wondering what pilgrimage might look like for those without, the ability to go to the Cairngorm Mountains every day.
Yeah, a really important question and observation. I think one of the beautiful things about what Nan Shepherd does in her book called The Living Mountain, in which she really allows the Cairngorm mountain range and her love for it to be like a metaphor of our relationship with Earth, and calling us very much into a love affair with Earth, not just a knowing of Earth, not just trying to be in true relationship with it, but is loving Earth with a passion, the way a lover wants to come to know the beloved. And the importance that Nan places not just on knowing with our mind, but what she calls body knowing. And that's very much the way lovers know one another, through their entire being, not just their minds. So she's inviting us into that accessing of the full range of senses as a way of truly loving Earth. And one of the things that's really important in her writings is that she realizes that as she comes to know the heart or the essence of the mountain, as she comes to know the soul of Earth, she is coming to know more deeply her own soul. So to see soul of Earth and soul of each of us, soul of humanity, not as unrelated, but as essentially one. So how do we do that if we do not have the opportunity of someone like Nan Shepherd to be spending so much time in the pristine beauty of a place like the Cairngorm Mountains? there are ways in which we can do this in the city. And I think any great spiritual tradition should not be limited to only knowing the divine through earth by going to places of extraordinary beauty like the Cairngorms or like the island of Iona in the Western Isles of Scotland, where I was last week with a group of international pilgrims. And my goodness, Iona was just at its most beautiful last week, and full moon blessing us halfway through the week, and very clear skies. I don't think my moon consciousness has ever been so well fed and nurtured as last week on Iona. So these really important times should not be seen as therefore we better live in the Cairngorms or we better live on Iona, but allowing these moments when we do experience them, the beauty, the wildness, the untamableness of earth, allowing these moments to be like sacraments that feed our awareness, feed our souls, so that when we go back to the city, we go back with a renewed sight. We go back with greater attentiveness to seeing something of the beauty that we've known in the very wild places, and to look for that in the landscape, in the moonscape, in the seascape, the skyscape, even within city context. We're so many of us have much more access to sun consciousness and moon consciousness in the city than we may think. Many of us have accesses to city parks and city gardens, to an attentiveness to bird life and bird song, and to recover this ancient awareness that even song and sort of morning practices of meditation, we can almost wherever we are, we can pay attention to the way birds sing their morning song or sing their twilight song at the end of the day. And I think one of the ways that we can definitely, on a much more regular basis, access the almost unbelievable sacredness and beauty of earth is to be much more attentive to the food that we are handling, and to what sort of food we are consuming, what sort of food we're wanting to share with our families and with those with whom we gather around the table. Or what are the conditions in which food has been organically tended and grown? And I think we can, in and through those ways, really taste and touch the something of the sacredness of earth that someone like Nan Shepherd experiences in a much more sort of intense and enduring way of spending time in the Cairngorms. I love what she says, speaking of this sort of theme of coming to know and love the body of earth the way a lover longs to know and delight in the body of her beloved. I love it when she says that no one really knows the mountains who has not slept with it. And, how do we allow ourselves, even in the city context, to know something of that intimacy of relationship? And I think that if we're intentional, we can find those ways. And, in the city, we so often are bombarded by or listening to sort of fabricated sound and music, and often sort of glued to television and so on. And there are ways in which we can choose, well, tonight, I'm going to sit in the garden and listen to the wind in the pine trees, or, tonight I'm going to make sure I place myself by a window in the house where I can see the full moon rising, and just pay greater attention to the opportunities we are given in the city.
I'm having a memory as you speak about the years I lived in Istanbul, lived in the inner city, and I remember on my way to work every day, I would pass by a very developed area, hardly any plant life at all. But against one little fence outside of a shop, there was a plant that had sprung up from a seed between the cracks on the sidewalk. And it was a cilantro plant, which was surprising because cilantro as an herb is not really available in Istanbul. So I watched this plant grow, and many days as I passed by it, I'd kind of surreptitiously greet it and say good morning. Sometimes I would touch it. But the moments when I would maybe encounter that plant each morning had had the effect of centering me in some way for the day. So there was just something really sacramental about that plant. There was something sacred in the plant itself, in my relationship to the plant.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very beautiful.
Well, John Philip, I've been thinking a lot about a recurring theme that you identified at the start of our conversation here as the sacredness of every human being. You know, Nan Shepherd, for example, for her it's a matter of falling in love with the enchanted radiance of all things. And for Edwin Muir, it's about looking for the light of the eternal in all things and to be experiencing the presence of the immortal within everything that has being. So as much as I'm drawn to the idea, I also struggle to fully embrace it. And I've been carrying it around with me, almost in a way, testing it against reality and really testing it against my own capacities to live that reality, to really see people in that way. One of the realities I tested against, of course, has everything to do with the current political realities in the U.S. and my stance personally towards others that sometimes I think is less than generous. And I'll be honest, case in point, my most challenging test case is probably thinking about Donald Trump. I simply don't know how it's possible to see the enchanted radiance in him, much less fall in love with it. So, that's my test case, and it's an extreme example, but if this is true, it's got to apply everywhere and to everyone. And so my question for you is, where is the hope for a different way of seeing the divine in others, especially those folks with whom we fundamentally disagree, maybe especially as we approach in the States this coming election?
Yeah. Yeah, a really important question and struggle. In engaging with that sharing and struggle, I don't want to, in any sense, belittle the struggle. And because I think many of us are there. One of the teachers that I draw from in my previous book, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, when I was drawing much more on the lineage of Celtic wisdom, but it very much touches on this point, and I think in this present book, The Great Search, I think we can see it in someone like the great Jewish teacher Martin Buber as well, who's really inviting us to look for the eternal thou, as he puts it, deep within every person. And that's an equivalent to someone like Edwin Muir looking for the immortal shining, and not only in every life form, but deep within every human being. This Celtic teacher that I'm thinking of, the 9th century Irish teacher, John Scotus Eriugena, when he refers to the Satan figure in Scripture, he always calls him by name, which is Lucifer, which means angel of light. And one of the things that Eriugena says about Lucifer is that he's false to the extent that he's not being himself. He's false to the extent that he's not living from his true essence, light of the divine. And it may be that Eriugena believed in some sort of personified presence of evil. But I think whether he did or not, I've always experienced his teachings on that front to challenge us to look for divine light, even in those who are destructive, even in those who are being horrendously false, even in those who appear very, very much to be almost possessed by the father of lies. So Eriugena has this belief that it's important to call Satan by his name, Angel of Light, and to allow that to remind us that the essence of this great angel is light. And so how do we call one another by name? How do I call Donald Trump, for instance, or Putin, or anyone who appears to be perpetrating terrible wrong and suffering? How do I call these ones brother of light? And I think what someone like Eriugena is doing is inviting us into this way of seeing, to not define the the lies, the destructiveness, the perversion, the wrongs that someone like Trump has done to women, to not define them, but to see that they are being false to the extent that they're not living from their true essence. And I think that one of the things that this way of seeing enables is for us to avoid the potential self-righteousness that can characterize a lot of political debate, so that in the face of that sort of destructiveness and falseness, we're not calling the other to become like us, which of course undermines often great movements for change and vision, because there's nothing to be said for that way, and I don't believe that way is a way of profound bringing about of change. So how do we allow ourselves to forever be looking for that place of light deep within the other, and trying to address that place, not just with a condemnation for the falseness and the destructiveness? I think we need to confront those, we need to name those, we need to become more conscious of them and try to enable others to become more conscious of them, but not to identify the essence of the person with that falseness and with those lies. And as well as providing us with a way of seeing the other in those challenging contexts and relationships, I think Eriugene is also inviting us to see ourselves in these terms, because sometimes we can be very harsh in our sort of self-judgment in times of failure, in times of betrayal or falseness. And it's important that we see one another with the sort of light of generosity that someone like Eriugene does, even in relation to the Lucifer figure. And because I think if we identify another in terms of their lies and their destructiveness, then in a sense we turn the other into a monster. And in a sense, the only way to deal with the monster is to try to destroy the monster, rather than to look for the way of redemption, the way of healing, the way of transformation. Martin Buber looking for the eternal vow in the other. And this is something that he teaches not in a sort of armchair theology way. He lived through some of the horror of Nazi Germany, and then he went to Jerusalem for the safety of his family. He escaped Nazi Germany. And then he saw in Jerusalem and in Palestine, he saw his own people doing to the people of Palestine what was being done to his people, in a sense, in Europe. And it's in that context that he's saying, I don't believe that anyone is unredeemable. And interestingly, he speaks about redemption as the restoration of betweenness, the restoration of true betweenness. So what is our role with someone who we can't see easily beyond the lies, beyond the falseness? What is the role we can play in that sort of restoration of betweenness? And in a sense, this is what we have primary responsibility for, is our own response, our own way of seeing. And I believe we can play a part in the restoration of betweenness by choosing not to see their essence in terms of the falseness of their speech, their behavior, their history. Yeah.
On the news recently, I heard about the fact that an American talk show host, Stephen Colbert, for a couple of years refused to speak the name of Trump in any context. And there was something in me that thought, oh, I want to do that, right? There's something powerful, perhaps in a healthy way, about the thought of dismissing someone to non-existence, right? Which in itself has got to be something that wars against the soul. But I'm taking seriously your words, this possibility that perhaps I can work to discipline myself to at least name Donald Trump as a brother of light, even if it doesn't resonate emotionally, but to simply try to walk in that truth. And I think, that discipline, while it certainly stands to potentially transform my perspective of all people, I think even more it stands to transform me If I could actually learn to see that way, I would be a fundamentally different person.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm thinking about the importance of this call to see the divine light in every person. How important it is, not just when we think about the world and its public forms, but also in our own religious and spiritual communities. Thinking about the kinds of transformations and shifts that we're talking about, that the figures in your book are talking about, standing in that sort of prophetic space, it's easy to slip into our own self-righteousness, finding that balance between trying to tell the truth and call to a greater truth and clarity with loving people where they are and in their essence. I think it's a real challenge, and I think I learned a lot and was challenged by the story of Edwin Muir in your last chapter. I loved the challenge that he gave me, talking about the limits of formal historic creedal beliefs when they actually disconnect us from physical reality or from our lived experience. And I think about the poem that you quoted, his poem on the incarnation. And the word made flesh is here, made word again, speaking about maybe a more rigid kind of institutional church form. And yet he kind of made this journey that brought him back to a place of love and care. And I'm wondering what you might say to someone like me on that journey, or perhaps a pastor trying to guide her congregation in this direction. How can we both try to make the word made flesh, kind of make that real and call for that deep transformation in our communities, and hold on to loving people kind of for who they are and where they are?
I think that in our journeys, what most deeply sustains us and moves us forward is experience, rather than instruction, or rather than others telling us what to do or what to become. So that I think that the more we can allow ourselves to experience the sacred, the stronger we will be in the path of living in new ways. And I think that's one of the marks of soul at this moment in time. I think so many of us who are much more in wilderness or in exile would, in various ways, want to say, I want to know the sacred. I don't want to know about the sacred. And faith has been defined so much in terms of what you believe about the divine, and to the extent that even many Christians have defined themselves as Christian because they believe certain things about Jesus, and this is, of course, all based on teachings and sort of hierarchy of truth, and agreeing to sign up, in a sense, to propositional statements about the divine. And that was the type of faith that someone like Edwin Muir lost, because those statements about God and about humanity and about earth that the church was teaching as part of its creedal and doctrinal formulations, those didn't in any sense match or address the suffering that he went through as a young man, when 3 members of his family died within 1 year in the sort of poverty and industrial injustices of early 20th century Glasgow. So the turning point for him came, I think, when he realized that faith was not about giving assent to statements about the divine, but was much more to understand faith as being faithful to this immortal shining that he increasingly saw in all. And I think one of the really interesting things about his journey is that his journey into faith and into faithfulness sort of reconnected with his childhood and some of his earliest experiences of the universe and his experiences of family. And I think that that's an important sort of reconnecting to how can we re-access the child's way of seeing, because I think the child does see the universe as light-filled, and the child will tend not to demarcate one people from another, and even the human species from Earth's other species, until, in a sense, the child is trained into demarcating and often lessening those who are not part of one's own people or one's own religion or one's own culture. So I think part of the way forward is to find ways of re-accessing this child's way of seeing. And all great spiritual traditions have celebrated the child. And I think that's part of the beauty of someone like Edwin Muir's journey of faith, that it's a journey that takes him back into a type of consistency with some of his earliest experiences of a light-filled universe.
Yeah, it actually, what you're saying reminds me of a recent learning cohort that Forrest and I helped lead. At one point, Forrest led us in a imaginative exercise of remembering a place or a time, not necessarily when you were a child, but a place when you felt that deep connection and oneness. And for me, it was took me back to a place in time when I was a teenager, in a particular path through the woods in the town that I grew up in. And what struck me was I had reflected on that place and time and its sacredness and its impact on my life many, many times. And yet the way Forrest invited us to explore that place again in our memories brought out new meanings and just a deeper sense of gratitude and connection and insight that I thought, wow, I think there's even more there. And I agree with you that most of us, perhaps all of us, have those core memories or experiences that tap into something primal and elemental about us, that there are ways of being, particularly in the West, that kind of move those aside or bury them. And part of our task, I think, is to unearth them and let them breathe again.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. I think, as something that your words reminded me of something else that Edwin Muir says. I'm not sure that I wrote about it in the chapter, but he has the sense of almost like redeeming a memory or redeeming of parts of our past. And he says that parts of our past, when we remember them, it's almost as if at that time in our past, we were only seeing the beauty or the light in a peripheral way. It was almost as if it was just sort of out of the corner of our eye because we weren't focusing properly on it. And he describes, in a sense, going back to those moments and allowing ourselves to give full attention to that light that only seemed a bit peripheral at the time. And because these are our journeys through the mystery of life. And I think we can go back and reclaim certain moments as full of light. It's fuller of light than what we realized at the time.
John Philip, as we draw our conversation to a close, I want to harken back to where we started with this idea of exile. There's a term that I've learned from my friend Victoria Lewis, who's one of the founders of the Wild Church movement. And she describes herself with the term edgewalker. And what she means by that is someone who's walked away from the dominant mainstream center of the church, but not left it entirely, not given up. And so an edgewalker, as we now use the term, stands far enough outside the limiting structures of church that they can see beyond those limits to what else might be possible for a church reborn or a church reimagined. And it seems to me that many of the people that you write about are edgewalkers. What about the stories of these people, in a general sense, that you talk about in The Great Search? What principles or values might help us to become better edgewalkers and to help, as you put it, to bring about the birth of something new?
I think edgewalkers is a fine way of describing what what many of us are experiencing. And the important thing at this moment in time is to ask, well, what's trying to be born? What's trying to come forth that has never been before? And the 9 great prophetic figures that I draw from a whole range of nations, religious traditions, different epochs, I believe that all of these great prophetic teachers are addressing the yearnings of the human soul that I'm identifying as particularly to the fore at this moment in time. And I think one of the interesting things about these prophetic figures that I'm drawing from, many of them in their own age were considered way out on the edge, or even sort of heretical thinkers within their religious traditions. And it's interesting that now, here they are, very close to the heart of this moment. That is, their wisdom can feed the yearnings that I think are deep in this moment. All of these great teachers are, in their sort of wonderfully varied ways, pointing to the sacredness of earth and pointing to the sacredness that is at the heart of every human being as where we will find healing and where we will find new beginnings. I would also say that the term has some limitation, because maybe one of its limitations could be that Edgewalker might give the impression that the center is not everywhere. One of the things I say in the conclusion is that just as new science is enabling us to understand that the center is everywhere in the universe, so it is spiritually. And I think it's important to remember that the center is deep within us, and the center is at the heart of every moment. And we don't have to be walking in an edge in relation to the center of the divine deep within me, or I don't need to be on the edge to seeing and remembering and being committed to the center of the divine that is in you and in every human being and life form. So maybe the term Edgewalker has come about because our traditions have so often claimed to be the center. Places like Rome and Jerusalem and Mecca have often inflated themselves to the point that we've said, that's the center of our tradition, or even the places we gather in our temples and synagogues or mosques or churches. There's been sometimes the impression given, that should be the center of my faith. And I would say, I understand that term, and I think that's where many of us are in relation to our religious inheritance. And let's be faithful to those both within our tradition and those who are struggling in the exile. But I think maybe I would say that my way forward is to be committed to remembering and living that the center is now, and that the center is deep within me, and the center is deep within every person and life form that I meet. And I don't have to walk on the edge there. I can find ways of really trying to be present to, trying to be faithful to, trying to be in true relationship with that center of the divine.
We've been in conversation with John Philip Newell about his new book, The Great Search, Turning to Earth and Soul in the Search for Healing and Home. For more information about John Philip, about his organization called Earth and Soul, or about other things we touched on in the conversation, please go to this episode's show notes. The Earth Keepers podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization committed to cultivating a more ecologically conscious faith. For more information about the podcast, or to learn about the ways you can support this work, go to our website at earthkeepers.online. You can contact us by leaving a voicemail through the podcast website, or by emailing us at earthkeepers@circlewood.online. I am Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. James Amidon is our executive producer. Our content editor and researcher is Colleen Meggerly, and our sound engineer is Dave Wolfers. Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director, and Forrest Reed is the composer of our original music. Thank you for listening, friends, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.